Hey, Kevin, good morning. Thanks so much for joining on an off day while you and the bees are on the West Coast out there in California.
Thanks, Mike. Excited to be here.
Likewise, I'm very excited to um, have you on. As people know, if they've been keeping track here, born and raised in the Boston area, have my Bruins zip up hoodie on, and you of course are the performance director or director of performance at the Boston Bruins. So it's very cool from that perspective to speak with you. But we're not just going to focus on the Bruins and maybe not even hockey completely. But before we get into your background and go to the topics that we want to cover, with ending with behind the data, where we'll learn more about you behind or outside of sports, outside of data. I wanted to give the audience an idea of the ideal outcome for today's episode, so they know what to expect. And so, in this episode, I'm gonna try to be ambitious. I'm gonna try to be ambitious in terms of helping the audience to understand from the athlete perspective, and even the data professional, data practitioner perspective, what they can get from your experience working at, like I mentioned, Boston Bruins. You've worked with U.S. women's ice hockey in terms of national teams over the years as well. You have Neeld Performance in terms of working with athletes. And then you also, in terms of that, have Evolving Performance podcast where you speak with other practitioners in the performance space that cover a range of sports and topics. So we're going to, again, be ambitious from my perspective in terms of bringing that all together to help the athlete learn something on how they can improve in terms of their development from yourself and other experts that you speak with. And then also from the data professional and practitioner perspective, because as we know, there's so much data out there. It's always great to hear from the performance professional on, how to best work with someone like yourself and communicate with the athletes as well. So, does that sound cool to you?
Yeah, it sounds great.
All right, sweet. So, before we go into again covering off that those ambitious or the ambitious outcome across the topics, what we like to do is start almost like in the beginning and get a sense of the guest background to help shape or help describe in the point of view that you have, like what has shaped that. So can you give us a sense of like how you got into sport or sports in the first place from the performance perspective? Did that start from like educational background? Was there something in your upbringing, or is it something completely different that helped get you to where you are today?
That's a great question. For me, my entry point into sport performance really came from being an athlete. I played hockey growing up, played other sports when I was younger, but really fell in love with hockey at a young age and stuck with that, throughout middle school and high school, played in college. But it was really my think it was in eighth grade that, I had been cut from a couple teams and ended up crossing paths with a coach that at the time was way ahead of the curve as far as integrating off ice training and power skating from, as far as teaching and working on the skill of skating as a primary focus of practice time and of the work that he did. And, I just as I went through the training on and off the ice, just really felt that it had a significant impact on, how I was able to play. And I fell in love with that aspect of it, that, you have this opportunity as an athlete to put in extra time, put in extra work, focus on weaknesses, and as a result of that work, make improvements that maybe the people around you that aren't willing to put in that time and energy aren't making. And so I knew probably at 14 or so that I wanted to pursue a career in hockey, helping hockey players develop. And it wasn't as clear to me at that point, if that was going to be more on the ice or more off the ice. But I had a pretty clear vision of, which direction I wanted to go with my future at that point. And, for me, like I went to the University of Delaware as an undergrad. I studied health behavior science and minored in strength and conditioning there, and never really had any aspirations of going to grad school. It was kind of I'm going to get my degree and then go out and work. And my dream at the end of college was really to work in a private facility that focused on or specialized in training hockey players. And as my undergrad progressed, I got some advice that if I ever wanted to work in high level team sport, that I would need a master's degree to do that. So, it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to potentially pursuing a master's degree, and ended up going to UMass Amherst, which was a great experience. I spent 2 years there. In that time, I was able to, uh, develop some more experience as far as interning with Chris Boyko, who was the strength and conditioning coach there. Chris introduced me to Eric Cressy, who some of your listeners may be familiar with. Eric is now the director of player health and performance with the New York Yankees. I interned with Eric between my first and second year of grad schools there. So I was able to intern with Eric, and he really was several years ahead of me in his evolution of opening a business in the private sector, and he was a perfect person to learn from. And when I graduated from UMass, I basically had an opportunity to go work at a facility called Endeavor Sports Performance right out of the gate, which was a private facility that trained athletes in all sports, but really focused on hockey players, and had a good base of both youth and junior level and college hockey players to start with. So that was really kind of the path for me. It was, me being a very mediocre athlete that had to work exceptionally hard to be slightly less mediocre, and falling in love with that process, and, falling in love with the game of hockey, and just knowing that I wanted to pursue a career helping players develop. And, it was over my time at UMass, really, that was kind of the fork in the road moment, that I ended up spending more time on the strength and conditioning and the sport performance side of things, and not as much on the ice. So, I spent 7 years working with Endeavor, 5 of which, as you referenced, I had an opportunity to work with the women's national team with USA Hockey, and Mike Boyle through that program. Then had an opportunity to go work in San Jose for 2 years as an assistant strength and conditioning coach with the Sharks, and then was fortunate to have the opportunity in Boston. So, kind of a quick rundown of middle school through now, but it's been a fun journey.
And the journey will keep continuing, right? That's the thing. A part of why I love doing these episodes and speaking with folks in different sports, different roles, different backgrounds, is to help show that we all come from such different places. At the end of the day, might have similar hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and there's different paths to get there. And what I found, or what we found in the last few episodes, like with Luke Jenkinson at San Diego FC, or Jesse Green, who's now at 1080 Motion, but was at the Penguins, or even Joey King, who's at Riser and Tread, focusing on more mental health coaching and performance from a clinician perspective, is like everyone, they all played sport to some capacity, had an interest, fell in love with like the sport and like the process and like that positive experience, maybe didn't quite make it to the professional level or even college level or what have you, but like wanted to stay involved in some way and like use those lessons they had along the way. It's mostly failures. And in a lot of the episodes I share, like, if people at least just learn from my mistakes, then that's a good thing. But it helps us again, like, shape who we are in terms of continuing the journey. So really do appreciate that, because again, I'm repeating myself though, we want to help people show like you can pursue these opportunities. There's very different paths to get there, but ultimately, like, understand what you want to get out of it. So like you mentioned, like you wanted to go work right away. Luke and Jesse said the same thing. They're like, had to do some of the schooling, but wanted to just get right into it to be the practitioner and professional, because as we know, many of us learn by doing. And so you mentioned Mike Boyle there. He has not yet come up on an episode in reference to anything around data and sport. But in speaking with Nikita in the episode, I guess it was 11, we were talking about when he and I were playing junior hockey together before going to college in like '05. A lot of this didn't exist in terms of like the performance centers and the academies and schools just for sport or just for hockey. The podcasts like the one you have in terms of evolving performance, or Eric Cressy's podcast. Like, actually in New England, I think it was like Mike Boyle. It was then called Body by Boyle. And if you were, I think, lucky enough to work with him, then that gave you a big leg up. But like now, today, and we'll come back to this, like there was opportunities everywhere for athletes, and it really comes down to them making the most of it. So let's jump into, I guess, the first area again, like focusing on the athlete's perspective, or how from your experience data plays a role, or maybe is playing a growing role in terms of the work that you do with athletes and performance, and where you might see that going. So, and I want to tie it to actually an episode. I think it was actually your episode one of Evolving Performance with Vicky Vendas. And this one stuck out to me, and I wanted to make sure to mention this because you just talked about how, in terms of training, when you were playing, and it was the same for me, it was like power skating, and it was like the thing to go to get better. Well, what I remember about my dad driving me down to Pembroke from Dorchester to go to power skating there was like it was just like they just bust your butt. It's just like go harder, do more. What Vicky spoke to was like all the data being collected around acceleration, max velocity that I couldn't have even fathomed, right, until I heard that, right? I just assumed it was like still the same. So from the maybe focusing on ice hockey, like how much of a role is data playing in the performance aspect from off ice training or testing? And I guess how has that changed in the last, call it 10 years or so?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think first off, Vicky, when it comes to speed training in the hockey space, Vicky's brilliant. If anybody listening has an interest and has not is not familiar with Vicky and hasn't connected with her, I'd highly recommend that they do that. I think, Mike, with training in general, one of the things that I've learned over the course of my career is that the same inputs can lead to very different outputs. And what I've tried to do over the course of my career is find ways to identify what the needs are of the athlete and then to kind of build testing into their training process to create feedback loops to make sure we're on the right track. So, to answer your question specific to speed training, if somebody excels with acceleration but struggles with change of direction or struggles with top speed work, for example, the training strategies you might use to help them are going to be different than somebody that doesn't accelerate well either. And, in hockey, you hear a lot about first step quickness, and that really speaks to that early acceleration phase of skating. So, I think having some objective numbers to start to look at, one, how does this player look relative to their peers, across their age group or across their competitive level is one layer. How do they look relative to the players competing at the level that they aspire to play at is another level to look at some of the data. And then the third is just how are they trending over time? And, if we are using testing to say, all right, this player has a deficiency in, let's say, hip range of motion and early acceleration, and then we design a training program that is specifically put together to address those limitations, then we need to have some sort of feedback loop to make sure that what we think we're doing from an intervention standpoint is actually delivering the results that we need. And I think that especially now, there's so much access to so much information that it can become overwhelming for the practitioner. It certainly can become overwhelming for the athlete who, in my experience, there's kind of three different scenarios. One is the athlete doesn't care about it at all. They just, they'll do whatever is asked of them, but they don't want to be burdened by the numbers. They just want to, show up, do their job, and then move on. There's some that maybe want to learn a little bit more about why it's important for us or for anybody to be collecting this information and how it's going to be used to help them. And then the third group is really into it. They want to know what their numbers are. They want to know how they're changing over time, what they mean, those sorts of things, that they're really invested in that part of the process. And I think, though, with all of them, too many numbers can become prohibitive for decision making and getting the outcomes that you want. So, it's analogous, like people early on, when you're putting together these reports, they're referred to as dashboards. And I think the analogy there is that, everybody, when you're driving a car, you have a dashboard, and, the newer cars, you can toggle the different screens. So it'll show you how fast you're going, your engine temperature, your oil levels, your tire pressure levels. And the overwhelming majority of those things, as the driver, you do not need to know the overwhelming majority of the time. But if something goes wrong, you have access to a lot of information that can help you pinpoint exactly what you need to do to get back on track. And, there are things like the speedometer, the speed gauge that people are probably glancing at on a more regular basis. And, ultimately, I view that as a feedback loop. You think you're driving a certain speed, you can glance down, oh, I'm a little slow, a little fast, make an adjustment, and then keep going. It's not this wild overhaul of what you're doing. It's just, quick feedback, slight adjustment, and then keep going down the path. And I think for the strength and conditioning side of things, there's a lot of expertise that goes into putting together a purposeful training program. People have been doing that for decades without the granularity and the level of data that we have access to today. I think out of respect for all of those practitioners, they've probably done a great job without all of this additional information. So, it's not to say that now we have access to this, we're going to change everything. It just gives you a little bit deeper insight into how, potentially the specificity of the interventions that you're designing, but then also how the athletes are responding to it. And I think that that's a big area that we're still learning about as an industry is, why, if you have two athletes that, similar gender, similar age, similar sport, even similar position, and you do the same thing with them, why does one respond really well and one respond not as well? Or, why do some people feel really good after doing certain training interventions and other ones feel really good doing something completely different? So, I think that those are areas that at a minimum, as a sport performance or strength and conditioning practitioner, you have to listen to the athlete. That's one of the best feedback loops we have access to. But, having even just subjective feedback from the athlete through wellness questionnaires and things that, maybe aren't viewed quite as objectively as heart rate variability and some of these other physiological measures can still be really impactful in how you treat an athlete on a day-to-day basis from an intervention standpoint.
Yes, so there's a couple things there that ties to maybe adjacent topics in prior episodes, which is one, context matters, two, everything in balance. So to your point on, and these are my words, it's not collecting data for collecting data's sake. It's what is the outcome you're trying to get to, or what are you trying to understand? And then use the relevant information to do that. And then tied to that, it's again balance. It's qualitative and quantitative information to understand again like the context to it in terms of again like what the athlete might be feeling. And so Nikita on the episode, I guess, yeah, 11, talked about how when he works with his clients in hockey, he has them keep a journal, like write down, what did you eat today, how did you sleep, how did you feel, if you played well, write that down so that you can go back in your journal and get a sense of like, okay, when I played well that day, what happened? What was I doing? And from his perspective, it's, kids or young adults prior to going to college to help them get a sense of like listening to their body and getting a sense of what works for them. And he also tells them like, don't look at the highlight reels. Like that's not, at least in hockey, how the game is played. And from like a scout perspective, they're not looking at just like the highlights and the stats. It's like, are you a student of the game? And I believe that translates also from the off ice component of it, because one, it's about good habits, it seems, and then it's just again like understanding like what it is it what is it that works for you. And so, are you and others seeing that? I don't want to just say kids, but like young athletes, younger athletes, even professionals are more in tune with these sort of like one modalities like journaling, two, asking questions about why or wanting to understand and be empowered. And they're just more into like, is the trend that they're more into it, even somewhat from the data perspective? I understand you said there's about a third, a third, a third. There was a general trend that kids and developing athletes are being more educated themselves and are more aware of this because again, now to relate to when I was playing and I stopped playing in college in '06, like as far as I remember, it's like didn't exist. It was just like you went out there, you had to like work harder if you wanted to do better, and there was not much else.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hard work is still a critical
Of course,
component
yes,
for
yes. Do not
players,
stop working hard.
playing
Do
them
not
into
stop
better
working hard.
roles. But no, I think, Mike, you touched on two things there. I mean, one, I think the younger generations are more prone to ask why, why are we doing this? How's this going to help me? Which I think can be really productive in a lot of cases because it's an opportunity. It opens the door for a conversation to help educate them on why we may be asking, or suggesting a certain thing. So there's that. And then I also think that the data collection and testing aspect of sport participation is more deeply ingrained at youth levels now, certainly than it was when I was growing up playing. So I think that there's players are used to wearing heart rate monitors, they're used to having whatever tracking devices. There's more and more players that are coming up with other tracking devices, whether it's things like, Aura rings or Apple watches or some of these other things that are providing feedback to them on their activity levels, their recovery, their sleep. And so, I think the exposure is way higher than it has been in the past. And there's good and bad to that too. I think obviously this is a data and sports podcast, and I find a lot of value in having access to information that can then be used to provide feedback to, either what the player's done, how they've responded, are they progressing and performing in a way that is in line with their expectations and the teams. I also though think that the athlete relationship with data uh, really needs to be addressed on a individual basis. Meaning, there's certain players that if they wake up and they look at their sleep tracker and it says they're not recovered, that's going to send them down an undesirable path from a mental preparation standpoint. And all of a sudden there's an anxiety and a worry about them not being fully recovered, instead of other players may wake up, see the same information and say like, all right, that's, probably what I was expecting. And I just need to spend a little bit of extra time doing the things that are going to help me feel the best given this state that I'm in. And, I think that that's one that everybody's wired a little bit differently that way. And a lot of the technology platforms now have opportunities to kind of toggle off what the athlete sees and then what may go to a coach. And that's not to hide anything from the athlete in a negative perspective. It's more to it recognize the situation that I just referenced, where some athletes may not want to see it. They may not respond favorably to seeing it, but if they show up to their team, show up to work, whatever the case is, and there's somebody there that has some recommendations that are going to help them feel better, and that's phrased in a way that does not provoke anxiety, like, hey, I looked at your data and like your recovery is really not good today, that's going to elicit the same negative response as them waking up and seeing it themselves. But there is kind of a path there for the athlete to benefit from the interventions without necessarily having to be confronted with the what's viewed as negative information up front. So I think the exposure and the curiosity around it is definitely progressed over the generations, over the last, certainly the last 5 to 10 years, but I would say even really moving to the decade before that. But I think as part of that, there's, obviously everybody's on social media now, everybody's being exposed to the marketing campaigns of all these companies that are promising, the next big thing in recovery, and whether that's modalities, whether that's supplementation, whether that's different things to help with sleep, or navigating autonomic nervous system tone, as far as being able to ramp up when you need to, being able to wind down when you need to. And the reality is the overwhelming majority of what athletes see on social media is a marketing campaign from a company that has not been fully vetted, meaning the claims that they're making have not been established through research literature or even really well conducted in-house studies. There's usually a good idea, and then a product comes to market, and then as people are kind of buying it and providing feedback, and or the device itself is collecting physiological information, then they can adjust their claims or not. But they have the opportunity to do that over time. But it's really the end user spending money to validate the technology, opposed to companies coming out with well established, reliable, valid products that can support the claims that they're making. And I think that can be a little bit of a slippery slope for athletes too, that you're constantly chasing kind of the next hack to give yourself a leg up, where the overwhelming majority of the benefits and preparation that athletes can achieve are from training consistently, eating well, sleeping well. And
It's the
high
boring
intensity
stuff.
training for me falls under the nutrition bucket too. So I worry a little bit about the ones that are jumping around and looking at, these different recovery strategies that aren't sleeping well at night and are on their phones all the time. And, they're finding these like really kind of out in left field training strategies, but then not doing more traditional, consistent, speed work, power work, strength work, conditioning, because that's where those are the big rocks for athlete development. And because they are tried and true, and because they are, have been consistently shown over time to have such a positive impact, they almost get swept into the background of like, yeah, I know that stuff's out there, but what's the next thing that I can do that nobody else is doing? A lot of those next thing strategies are, 1% improvements over, where the training, nutrition, hydration, sleep, that's really your 95% benefit.
It's the shiny object syndrome. We see this, from my background in the corporate world with B2B data. It's like, well, now it's these days, it's just like AI. It's like AI solves everything. So everybody's chasing AI, but they don't want to focus on the foundational core, like data management work or data governance, because it's air quotes boring. But it's where the most value is like derived from, and ensures that like things like AI can actually work. So I appreciate you going into that in terms of really giving that advice to the athletes of today from your perspective and experience. And it adds to, yeah, I would say adds to some of the things that Jesse Green said when I was like, don't tell me like Sidney Crosby does, because it's like not my business and not yours to share necessarily. Though, like, what do the top of the top do in both NHL and NBA from your perspective? And he's like, these are my words. They do the boring things and they stack them and they're just very consistent with it. There is no magic pill or bullet or whatever. And I'm with you in that social media can be a distraction. And also like tying to the prior episode with Joey Kang from Riser and Tread in terms of just like the mental aspect of it, like it just the social media for the athletes puts so much pressure on them because it's like you're comparing yourself to others, looking at these highlights and snippets. So I think folks might be excited to hear this from you, maybe not, because they maybe wanted the next thing. Though, again, it's like the data from the research shows, what it is that you're saying. It's the boring foundational things, the big rocks, or what drives the value, and it's just something that people need to focus on. And then, even though again it's called data in sports, almost every episode then ends up being not about the data at all. Because again, it's like a component of it. It's in context. So from having worked at the professional level with NHL for as many years as you have, and working with athletes and various ages, and then even from what you see with evolving performance podcasts, speaking with practitioners in other areas and other sports, was there some kind of like advice that you can give to the data professionals, or like the more and I guess analysts, data analysts, we can call them, that are wanting to get into sport or are in sport? Because we know that they can analyze data, though that's like, maybe I'm making it up, 10% of it. You'd alluded to like different athletes want to and or need to hear different levels of information based on their own mindset. Like, can you just speak to more as if like you're speaking to them on like how can they best succeed in an organization like San Jose, since you're not there now, or wherever, in terms of like what they need to be thinking about and working on and doing so that they can actually work with the athlete. Because we know if like the athlete doesn't want to talk to you, then like you're not going to be able to get through to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is to understand the needs of the audience. For me, I in two different organizations that I worked for, and I realize that data management practices have largely improved over the last decade. But in two different organizations, one of the first things I did was collected all the historical testing information and just put it into one document so that there was a central database of all the historical data, so that if we needed to reference anything in the future, it was in one place. And I think that for the people that make a living in the data space, that may seem like a kind of no brainer, that should have already been done step. But if you are integrating in, certainly in sport performance environments, for the first time, where there's positions being created now at a faster rate than ever before, that may be something that they need help with, is taking all of their historical testing information. You get people that are in positions like mine for over a decade, that may have all their testing information spread out in, we have a training camp folder, a development camp folder, in season folder, that if they wanted to look at how one player has changed over time, they might be clicking around in all these different areas, and, just putting things in one place that can be, referenced and queried can be a massive step for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of, obviously a lot of opportunities for data professionals to collect a lot of information and to, ask a lot of different questions and to use that information to present it in, countless different ways. The best way to approach that is starting with questions that the end users or that the audience has. So, if you're if you're entering a new team environment, I think, the best thing you can do is just ask a lot of questions yourself. Like, what are some of the struggles that people in different departments have, whether that's, in some of the more simple things, like I referenced, like, how do we know if a certain number is good or not? How do we know if a certain level of improvement is good or not? There's things like that, but then also, what is meaningful of all the, the full spectrum of information that can be collected? What's meaningful to me, maybe what's meaningful to me from a performance training standpoint may be different than what's meaningful to our head physical therapist that's looking at, return to play scenarios. That may be different than what's most meaningful to our head coach as he's, planning practices and schedules. So, all, and then certainly with the players, I think their perspective on things is going to be different as well. So, asking a lot of questions on what is the information that is most valuable for the different end users, and what are some of the pain points about getting that delivered to them? That would be, I think, the best place to start. And there's also like, as we discussed earlier, there's a information volume aspect of that too. And, I've that's one of the things that, when we have a new member join our coaching staff, that's one of the first questions I ask them is, what information do you want from me and how do you want it delivered? Some people want 3 bullet points in a text message. Some people want an email. Others may want a more in-depth report. Some may want nothing. It's more of a, like, if there's a problem, come talk to me. Otherwise, I trust you to do your job and use the
Hmm.
information to help the players and to help us. So, understanding the best delivery vehicle for the information is huge, because not everybody, if you're working in the data space, it's an interest of yours. You obviously see the value in it. You're passionate about, whatever aspect it is, whether it's database management or, the actual statistical analysis of things, the presentation of the data, all the above. But, if you're the head coach, for example, you have all these different, balls in the air that you have to keep an eye on. You're managing the schedule, you have media obligations, you're tied in with lineup decisions. And certainly at our level, there's salary cap considerations and needing to, be tied in with the front office and making sure that you're compliant and making the right decisions in that regard as well. So you may not be passionate about, sitting down at your laptop and clicking through, several pages of web reports with all of this data. You may just want the big take home messages texted to you. So, for the people working in data, I think it's important to recognize that, to ask those questions up front and to listen and, not get caught up in what you necessarily want to do, but finding the right way to present the right information in the right way based on the audience's needs.
Yeah, and it is a people-based business, right? In terms of sports. So that's like, a key high note there is like, don't get so caught up in the data because you're trusted that you know what you're doing, but know the audience, listen, and ask good questions. So thanks for that. Speaking of asking questions, I had two, I think, last ones I wanted to ask before we go into the behind the data and the last segment of the episode. And so one is it's through the lens of your evolving performance podcast. Because again, you're speaking with folks from different sports, different roles, different backgrounds, like generally a range of topics, again, all with the focus on performance and how it's evolving. Is there something that you can share with the audience here or the listeners here on, from your experience so far with Evolving Performance Podcast, How is performance evolving? Like, it's a big, broad question, though. Are there like a couple of areas that I guess we could say excite you the most about the potential for where like the performance space in terms of helping athletes is going?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. You referenced, episode one with Vicky and the level of detail that people working in sport now are able to collect information and use that to make adjustments, certainly to their training and their preparation, but also to getting feedback on different recovery interventions and how athletes are responding to those. I think as part of that, because there are so many different ways to collect data, that the traditional testing that would take place in most team sport strength and conditioning environments, it needs to change, and I think it already has. That the more we can embed data collection into the natural processes of the athlete without asking for them to do something extra is going to be critical moving forward. And I think that it's going to help us collect more consistent information and ultimately leverage that in a more effective way than, testing once every 3 months away from the sport and some of these more traditional strength and conditioning strategies. So that's a big one. I think one of the other ones, Mike, is just that there are a lot of different paths to get to a desirable outcome, and recognizing that, you hear a lot in sports medicine about evidence-based practice, and, evidence-based practice typically is referred to as, what does the research say? Where really it's kind of this, overlapping three-pronged approach of, what does the research say? What does the clinician or the coach's experience say? And then critically, what are the preferences of the athlete or of the patient, or depending on the environment of the person involved that's going to be experiencing these interventions? What are their preferences? And in my position, I'm fortunate to work with players across a wide range of ages. We have players that are as young as 18 up through 40 plus in my time in pro hockey, not with our current roster.
Hmm.
We get players from all over the world. We have players that, have been exposed to a very wide range of different training strategies. And when you listen to their feedback, you have a better understanding of what they've done, what they feel like they respond really positively to, and why. And, it's an opportunity for the people in our positions then to say, like, okay, we know we want to deliver this type of stimulus for the players on this day, and these players respond better to this, these players respond better to this, so we're going to pursue two kind of parallel paths to get to the same outcome that we want. I think in speaking with people like Andrew Hauser, that is really tied in, spent over a decade working in professional baseball, now has his own clinic out in Arizona, really tied into the physiological responses to different strategies. The way that he goes about like integrating respiratory training as a performance strategy, not just, you hear a lot about breathing from a, autonomic down regulation standpoint and a recovery standpoint, but in attacking respiratory function from more of a performance lens. It's just another example of, if a player has a conditioning issue, here's a whole new path that you could pursue to help them, make up some ground in that area. So, I think that's the other thing that's the thing that's really that makes this industry so exciting to me, is that, you're the more, the old cliche, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. Like, every time you open a door and get some surface level exposure, you realize that there's people that have dedicated their whole lives to going deep into a specific topic. And you're just never at a shortage of opportunities to continue to learn new ways to help, athletes develop and recover. So, that's something that, every episode, regardless of which side of it I'm on, if it's my
Yep.
podcast or if, I'm speaking to somebody like you on this, that, there's always an opportunity to learn and to evolve your approach over time to hopefully find different ways to get better outcomes.
Yeah, there is a lot that is evolving for sure. Maybe that's why you've named it evolving performance, and I mean that quite seriously. Like you said, in terms of there could be new research or science or interventions or what have you, or just different ways to think about something to add to the tried and true methods. Because, like to your point earlier, you have these practitioners who are doing this and helping athletes perform at like the elite level without all this technology, without the data. And actually, I have somewhere here a book that was actually met Dr. Zykowski, but Dr. Len Zykowski and Daniel Peterson wrote The Playmaker's Advantage. And they kind of speak to this a little bit. They focus mainly on the mindset component of it, but they've spoken to like how, from a testing perspective of like NFL Combine as an example, like the players aren't getting that much faster in terms of the testing, but yet the advancements are there in terms of like the physical components. So their perspective is, and they're looking for like statistical populations, and is the standard deviation actually, or the difference actually zero, meaning negligible in the grand scheme of things. So their perspective is like the next frontier of how they view it is like the mental component of performance. That's what they talk about in the book, is like what makes a playmaker. So that's where, to me, again, it comes to balance in this space, like in others. It's how do you take the tried and true foundational, like you said, evidence-based work and try to add on new modalities or interventions to help get the competitive edge. And there's the last thing there, you mentioned preferences. So Whelan Fu from episode 6, he's the performance nutrition at Tottenham Hotspur. He spoke to this from the nutrition perspective on like, you need to understand like the background of the player in terms of what their food preferences are to make sure they actually like like eat the food, right? Because soccer, I call it football, but soccer in America is a very skill-based sport. And it's what he described as like even the Premier League, you have these guys that have gotten away their whole career just based on their skill alone. And they don't do those basic things. But those who don't do hydration and nutrition recovery, they don't last. And so you've answered actually part of the last question I had, though I'll ask in a different way. Is there like a final takeaway that you have for athletes that want to empower themselves and take control or ownership of their own performance development if they listen to like nothing else here today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably two messages that I would want to convey. One is, don't attempt to vet technology by yourself. You should have people in your corner that can help you identify, within any given category, what the best option or options are for you to lean on, so that the feedback that you're getting is actually meaningful, that it's, again, that the technology has been vetted, it's valid, it's reliable. And in certain cases, there are certain metrics that a technology can provide you that are valid and reliable. And then there's others that the same technology will provide you that are not. So, understanding which ones to hone in and focus on, it's really important to have somebody in your corner, or multiple people in your corner, that you can bounce some of those ideas off of. Particularly when you're making purchases, you want to make sure that, even with professional athletes, you don't want to waste money. So you want to spend money on things that are actually going to help you. The other thing is, as we go through this transition where, there's more data collected on athletes, I think that there's probably an appropriate hesitation from athletes on, how is this information going to be used, and is it going to be used against me? I think being crystal clear on information that's being asked of you, what is that going to be used for? Who's going to see it? Who has access to it? What are the kind of the spectrum of use cases on that information? The other side of that coin is any information that can be used, quote unquote, against you, can be used to help support you. I think one of the things that comes up in hockey is, as players get older, there's now league supported in-game tracking on publicly available websites. Now anybody can go and look at a player's top speed from any game, the distance they covered. There's a bunch of measures now that are public access. And, I think early on there's kind of a hesitation as players get older that they're going to slow down. And then, front offices are going to use that against them in contract negotiations. And, I think the reality, and I think that that's an appropriate hesitation, like I've referenced before.
Yeah.
But the reality of aging athletes is that there is a point where everybody gets slower, right? Nobody's going to continue to get faster year over year over year through a prolonged extended career until they retire. So really the question isn't, is an athlete getting slower? The question is, what is the expected rate of decline based on players that have, whether it's the games played or the years played or, their age, a few different ways to look at it, but what is the expected rate of decline, and where is a given player relative to that rate? So, if you are a 37-year-old professional hockey player and your speed is declining less than the other 37-year-old professional hockey players, that's really a chip in your corner as far as, the preparation and your commitment to things away from the ice, or genetic gifts in some cases. But
Right.
that would be a way to use you getting slower in your favor because you're getting less slow compared to the other people in your peer group. I think that establishing base rates and using that as a comparative tool, for the audience, the segment of your audience that's working in data, that is an underutilized strategy. Even with injury rates, I think people in my position are always trying to do everything they can to minimize injury risk. And, it's almost the expected target is 0 injuries, but that's not the reality of competitive sport at any age group in any environment. So, having an idea of what are the expected injury rates, again, that might change based on gender and age demographic and playing time and a number of other factors. But trying to wrap your head around expected values and then using that as a comparative tool, I think is important. But, for the athlete, I think just recognizing that the information is just information. Anything that can be used against you can be used to help support you as well. And, not being afraid of the information itself. It's more, how is it being used? Who's getting access to it? And, and how are those people going to use it?
No, I mean, for sure, and player still has to play. Like, at the end of the day, they still have to perform regardless of what some of these, I think, stats or figures might show. And that's in all sports, right? There's that, like, longevity component to it, though. Again, similar to, like you mentioned, with data management and centralizing it to store it, to be able to do the analysis, just having an understanding of, like, the comparative, analytics and what that can mean in terms of peer groups. And again, like you said, expected value and how are you tracking against that? Seemingly, maybe for a data professional, quite boring stuff, though. Again, it's like, think of the audience and the outcome that you want to achieve. And it's like becomes very fascinating in terms of like what that means. Again, if they have the interest in sport, then I think that is a cool career opportunity for them in terms of thinking about moving into sport. I mean, it surely was for me, and it is for me for the data part of it. But we will leave it with that for now. So really appreciate the perspective and advice. And going into the detail, especially relating to the guests you've had on Evolving Performance to bring in their perspectives as well. So I think they'll appreciate those shout outs too. So let's go behind the data. Again, as like I mentioned, we've started with you in terms of your background. That's where we finish with guests, is to get a sense of who they are away from data, away from sports. And it's fun to get a sense of, people's preferences based on, things they like. Before questions we ask everybody, first one, is there a place that is like near, it could be near or far, that's like special to you or close to you? And if you want to share why, please do.
Yeah, I turned this past March. My wife's got a big birthday coming up this March, and wedged in between there is our 10-year wedding anniversary.
Oh,
So this
nice.
past summer, during the end of the off season, my wife and I brought our 2 kids to Greece for a little vacation and spent a couple of days in Athens, and then a little more than a week in Crete. And that, Mike, I think, like, between the history and the architecture and everything there was incredible. I think watching, my son's 8, my daughter was 4 at the time, has since turned 5, but watching them, get along and, be forced to hang out together because there's nobody else there to kind of run around with, and the relationship that they kind of developed and the interactions that they had, and then just how incredible all the people there were, how they treated my wife and I, how they treated our kids. I've told everybody afterwards that, every single restaurant we walked into, the hostess, the servers, they all got down on one knee. They all, addressed our kids, said hello, spent a
Nice.
couple seconds talking to them before they, kind of got on with the business of it. And I couldn't speak more highly of our experience there. And for me, up to this point, that was probably the best trip that I've been on. I think for me, it's Greece.
I love that. Also, happy belated birthday, happy early birthday, and
Yeah, thank you.
happy anniversary. Moving on to the next one. Is there a comfort food that you have, or just like a go-to that you appreciate, which could be, it could be homemade, it could be from a restaurant, maybe it's from Greece, from your trip?
Yeah, there's I think we travel around the country quite a bit. So there's a couple, restaurants in different cities that we really look forward to. And we're in LA now, and there's a restaurant called Koi in West Hollywood that has the best sushi I've ever had. So that's one that every year when we're out here, we try to make it a point to get out to go visit there if our schedule allows for it. Otherwise, Mike, I'm a pretty simple guy. I enjoy a good slice of pizza. And in Dedham, Massachusetts, where I live, there's a place called Bellagio. That's the best pizza I've found in Boston. So that's the comfort food for me. I think we try Friday nights are typically pizza nights in our household, so we try to visit there every week and get a pie for the family.
I have to check that out. I went to high school in Westwood, which is next to Dedham, and I have to check out Bellagio. I'm also very, very simple, and I'm gonna check out, I think, Koi. So appreciate that. Next, in terms of music, is there a song that puts you in a good mood, or gets you focused, or gets you pumped up? What is it?
Yeah, obviously working in a gym environment, we basically have music on all day long. So I've over the years have been learned to be a little bit less picky about what's getting played. And I've really come to enjoy literally every genre of music. I listen to country, I can listen to some of the techno and EDM, rap, classic rock, you name it. I've developed a taste for all of it. But, I think there's a song Burn Me by Sam Barber that I've been playing quite a bit over the last several weeks. And then, I think if I'm in a situation where, I'm training personally and, in a dark place and need a little bit of a push, I'm going to go one of two directions. I'm either going to go like a little bit older rock with something like Rise Against or Korn, or I'm going
Yeah,
to go probably Meek Mill
nice.
to get me through whatever I've left that day.
I love that. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna check out Burn Me and add it to the playlist. Okay, Kevin. Last but not least, you've given your feedback and recommendations or advice based on your own experience and lessons. But is there a book that you've read in the last year or two that's had an impact on you or taught you a lesson that you want others to check out?
Yeah, I just finished listening to Rob Gray's book How We Learn to Move, and I'm also right in the middle of reading is another one of his books called Learning to Optimize Movement. And Rob is in both of those books is sharing a lot of information about skill development and retention. And there's obviously some applications for my day job there, but now having young athletes in the house that we're watching how they practice, watching how they play, connecting the dots between what they're being asked to do in practice and what comes through in the games. I think Rob does an outstanding job of one, kind of dispelling some common myths about and really standard practices about how we go about developing skills and teaching sport. And then also some recommendations on, how to create these environments that may lead to slower progress, slower observable progress up front, but ultimately leads to better transfer to sport and then longer retention of the developed skills as well. So, that's Rob has several books. I'm, slowly chipping away at them, but that's an area that I think is really interesting. More specific, I think to people working with data. I really liked Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets, among other things
Yeah, have that.
highlights the uncertainty in the decision making process and the fact that you can make a really good decision and still have there you go, you can make
Yeah,
a really good decision and still have an undesirable outcome. You
outcome.
can make a poorly guided decision and still have a desirable outcome, and just recognizing the black box that's in between those two things in a lot of cases, and being honest about both ends. It's not getting an outcome that you want and then sweeping the decision making process under the rug and assuming that it was correct. And then there's another book that was a really quick, simple read that Chip Heath co-wrote called Making Numbers Count. And I think that speaks to communicating information simply in a digestible manner. That that's a book that you could probably read in a single flight.
I'm gonna have to check that out too. Um, Definitely need to improve in terms of communicating things. I would say, compare from like my brain to speaking it. And I've mentioned Darcy Norman's name so many times on these episodes. So sorry, Darcy. I just almost went an episode without it. And usually I talk about like when he talks about broad spectrum competency and how it has value. But Darcy on the first episode recommended Thinking in Bets, by Andy Dukes. Sign that in terms of checking it out, because I think it can help people through how they make decisions and take better decisions. But with that, Kevin, thank you so much for taking an extended time on an off day for you as you're out there with the team and the California trip. Really do appreciate it. We'll link some of those recommendations or list them in the notes. So again, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Mike. This was fun.
Anytime.